So with me up here up front is Zakir Hussain to my right from Visa, and Snehal Patel from Gap. So both these gents will join me in just walking through a quick update in terms of where we're at actually, and hopefully get a chance to share with you in terms of where we're going to take this. So polling. So I think this is a part of every working group session that we've done so far. So there's two questions over here, which if you will go into your app and answer, we'll be able to share the responses live. I think we've got one of the last slides as part of the session to share with you the results of this polling. So I'll give you about a minute or two to get your answers in, so we all know where the thought process is. I think the first is around secure exchange. You've heard Nick talk about it in the opening keynote session. And how does it relate to you, to your firm, in terms of the work activity that you might be engaged with around SD-WAN? And the second is around which of the open SD-WAN exchange use cases is the most important to you, which we'll get to as part of the session. So in terms of the current state assessment, and by the way, I'm going to keep this interactive, and it's only one mic, so I'm going to have to move the microphone around. But in terms of where we're at, I think the working group met as a team for about 6 months. And through several sessions, I think there was unanimous consensus that the SD-WAN as it stands today is pretty much custom in the sense that it's proprietary to the vendors, both traditional and in the startup space. They come in various form factors, right? Some of them started off as appliance-based devices and then gradually migrated to VMs. So we're seeing a combination of both in that space, be either deployed in production or in lab testing. And then we also know for fact that they're well integrated with the underlay protocols that the networks use from an IP standpoint, so whether it's BGP, OSPF, or even static routing for that matter. But we all agreed that there was certainly enterprise lock-in from both the hardware standpoint as well as from a software standpoint. So I think the key question we were trying to drive amongst the enterprise working group members was, hey, where does this take us? Because there's use cases. So as enterprises adopt, embrace, and accept SD-WAN as part of their solution portfolio, the technical landscape, if you will, or the business landscape rather, is continuously changing. So how does one go forward with the understanding that, hey, how will this space evolve? What's SD-WAN 2.0 look like? And so it brought up several use cases that we discussed as part of a team in order to see some form of interoperability, right? I mean, so you don't want to be stuck with lock-in from either a hardware or software standpoint, because like I said, I mean, these use cases are real. They're not going to go away. They're in place today, and we go about each of these use cases in a very, very traditional way of connecting networks. And so with that, I mean, I want to pass the microphone to Zakir to kind of share some of what the discussions were relative to a couple of the use cases here.
So, do you have a question? It seems like there's.
I have a sort of a high-level question. What is the overall objective of the working group? What is it that you're trying to address or assess by putting these people together in a working group?
Go ahead. I can take that. Okay. So it's generally to help evolve the ecosystem in the SD-WAN area for this particular working group. But there are other working groups like throughout the SD and ecosystem. Like we have other working groups which are addressing overlays, analytics, state information and monitoring and so on. So each one of those addresses a certain part of SD software-defined networking, and it is helping in the evolution from a customer point of view, and also help make the vendor community understand what is more important from a from a customer community perspective than just partnering with the vendor community rather than just consuming what the vendor has to provide. So it is kind of a partnership, if you will. Okay. So going back to the specific use cases that we had come up with for the SD-WAN interoperability, one of the main use cases is, like as Conrad had just mentioned, like the business landscape is more dynamic nowadays, and there is a lot of changes in business landscape through mergers and acquisitions or whatnot. And as we know, the SD-WAN is one area within software-defined networking, which is a little bit much more mature than the other areas or other lanes. It offers all these advantages of flexibility and agility and so on, but when it comes to actually looking at the scenario of M&A, when there is a situation where we have two different SD-WAN solutions, there is no path today to have an interoperable environment. So it has to be actually made interoperable, or the communication between two different SD-WAN has to happen through a data center through legacy protocols or legacy mechanisms that we have already in place. So there is no direct cloud-to-cloud connectivity, and that is one of the reasons that we are looking at this interoperability exchange or SD-WAN exchange. The other one would be like business partner connectivity, which is basically like even if there is no merger or acquisitions, we still as nowadays all businesses are interconnected with other businesses as partners or customers or whatnot, and if there are requirements for them to communicate between each other in a secure manner, and that's where we see the SD-WAN interoperability come into play, and the exchange might help there. So that is another use case that we see, and maybe like I'll let Snehal talk about a few other use cases, then we can come back to any questions that we have.
Thanks, Zakir. So before going specifically into these use cases, I wanted to talk about the bigger picture. I wanted to mainly talk about two predictions. The first one from IDC, which says that SD-WAN industry will be at a $6 billion industry mark by 2020. So that's a lot of SD-WAN hardware being deployed everywhere. And then the second prediction, again from IDC, was that in next 18 months, about 70 to 80% of organizations will be deploying SD-WAN. That's again a lot of SD-WAN deployments, and now there are about 20 to 30 SD-WAN vendors. So it's possible that everyone will pick a different vendor, and then there is a merger and acquisition. It really takes a lot of time and effort and money to deploy thousands of SD-WAN endpoints. And now if I acquire another company which is using a different SD-WAN, then I'm not going to rip and replace those routers. I probably need some kind of interoperability between the two SD-WAN vendors. I need a mechanism to extend tunnels or at least some kind of functionality so that my business continues depending on my new initiatives. So that's why I see a lot of potential in the marketplace merger and acquisition for the open SD-WAN exchange. Same thing, I don't want to be locked in with a vendor. I need some kind of flexibility to just keep building my connectivity and just be independent of vendor lock-ins.
Thanks, Nehal. Right. So I think I think we're at an inflection point, right? I think we're certainly starting to see SD-WAN deployments in production. but at the same time they're proprietary. So it's like, well, how do we get one SD-WAN vendor solution to talk to another, right? So I want to make this clear because I know when we had the working group calls, the last 2 calls were attended by vendors as well that have been part of this journey since 2014. And I think a question was asked appropriately so from one of the vendors saying, hey, we're not going to be able to share proprietary information, et cetera. And actually, so that was a really good question, but that's not the ask, right? I mean, so I think vendors do spend a lot of R&D money in coming up with proprietary patent-based technologies as part of their solution. All we're saying is how can the vendors together work with the customers to come up with a common construct, if you will, whether it's from a control plane perspective or from a forwarding plane perspective, to say, hey, here's the data elements that are important that we want to express to make this connection happen. So when we talk about the open SD-WAN exchange, we're actually talking about a framework, right? Because we clearly don't want just it to be vendor A talking to vendor B in the true sense of the word, right? It's got to be multi-vendor, it's got to be vendor agnostic, right? And at the same time, we don't want to be prescriptive in terms of, hey, what are those important data facets or control plane facets that need to be expressed to make this connectivity happen? Like I said, I think the need is not going away, right? It's here to stay. We're working with it rather traditionally, whether it's through B2B connections in data centers or connecting private cloud to the public cloud, or worse still, if you have an M&A, well, what do you do? So what we're saying is that the exchange point in itself can either be premise-based or cloud-based, right? Because I think most enterprise customers would like to have an option in terms of, hey, I have my own large private cloud. I want to have an internal instance. In some cases, that may change to say, hey, I want to have it in the public cloud. So we want to have that flexibility when we think about the exchange point. But I think before we even dive in, or vendors are part of this as well, and before we start thinking about control plane protocols and data plane forwarding engines, really the fundamental question that needs to be answered first in this context is around security and trust, right? So, because in reality is, I think when you look at SD-WAN deployments today, they're all, for the most part, based on prefixes that are well identified within the context of your network. Certainly when you merge or acquire another company, you might have overlapping address space, you might have different address space, you might have different definitions around trust. And so from our standpoint, we were saying, hey, how does trust get established? Who establishes it? How does it get established? When does it get established? And why, right? So I think answer the fundamental questions that then set the stage for, I want to say, implied security, right? So it's explicitly called out, so you know the tenants that the SD-WAN exchange will have to operate with between SD-WAN solution A tying back to SD-WAN solution B, right? So I think security and trust is foremost, because nothing gets connected without a level of security, right? I mean, and because there's also the compliance aspect, but we don't want to bring compliance and governance at this point in time as to where the working group activity or discussion has been. Then when we look at communications, it's like, hey, should this be a direct forwarding plane path between one controller to another controller, right? Or should it be through an intermediary exchange, which is the exchange point? Certainly, there's some flexibilities over there. Different vendors might think about it differently, but I think at the end of the day, we all need to come up with a common syntax that can be expressed to establish either a direct connectivity path or an intermediary exchange path. And I think I touched on this before, right? Common feature sets and protocols. I think the emphasis was not on anything that's unique or proprietary. It was more or less something that's in a common standard format that can be followed through by different vendors that play in this space. And I think when we started this journey, what's interesting is that when we started way back in late 2013, early 2014, there were just about 3 vendors who claimed to be in that space. 2 of them were startups. One of them was the traditional vendor that most enterprises use. Well, fast forward to today, there's, I think, probably 24 vendors all, playing in the SD-WAN space. So this is all the more important for us to kind of focus on and say, how do we get to common interoperability? Anything else to add?
So one point I would like to emphasize here is we are not looking for the SD-WAN solution itself to be open. They are still proprietary solutions. We are good with it, but what we are looking at is a open format so that there is a way to integrate 2 different SD-WAN solutions. So we are, that is a point I wanted to emphasize again, we are not looking for all the SD-WAN solutions to be kind of open standard or whatnot, but at least just the interacting, the exchange point part of it. And mainly other thing that I would add to that is when we are talking about common features, we are just looking at the very basic WAN features, even before SD-WAN was there. If you look at it, we had general routing, QoS, NAT, maybe maybe multicast and so on. So we are not looking for application level rerouting or some kind of an advanced level of security or whatnot. What we are looking at is some basic common features that is generally seen across the ecosystem of SD-WAN providers, and for those to be available on an exchange. So not the very specific or proprietary features, but the common features that we would expect out of a WAN environment.
So Zakir summarized it in a nice way. Just to recap, if I'm using a vendor A, I can use all the proprietary features of those vendors and just deploy SD-WAN. But now if I want to extend my WAN deployment from vendor A to vendor B, we can use those open SD-WAN features and open feature protocols just to extend my tunnels and just keep business moving.
So one other point I would add is when we are talking about this open exchange, we are not trying to take away the competitiveness between the vendors, but basically this actually opens up the customer base because there is no vendor lock-in. Now customers would be more willing to accept new vendors into their, from a technology transition point of view, into their environment. Even if they are using a vendor A today, then maybe tomorrow there is vendor B is better than vendor A, or a enterprise chooses to go with a different vendor. Now, because of this exchange capability, there is no more lock-in, so they can gradually bring in the other solution in-house without having to disrupt business services. So that's a big plus that we see in this exchange. Conrad.
Hey, thank you, Zakir and Snehal. So, I think, like I said, I think vendors certainly were apprehensive, at least at first. To me, it seemed that way because I chaired the calls on a monthly basis. And like I said, I think for the last 2 calls when we brought the vendors in, there was certainly some apprehension in terms of, hey, you want me to expose what? And so it wasn't like we were trying to be prescriptive, but I think by the end of our last working group meeting, I think there was consensus, even amongst the vendors, right, to have some sort of mutual success over here. So what I have over here is a listing of vendors that have kind of agreed to be on board with the Open SD-WAN Exchange, for which there will be workshops starting on a monthly basis coming up in June, I think the end of June 29th. NYU has graciously accepted to host these sessions, so they'll happen on a monthly basis. And hopefully we'll be able to take this from concept I've lost. Hopefully, we'll be able to take this from concept to fruition. It's going to take some time. Of course, there's going to be. It requires a great amount of commitment as well. So we're not in any way underestimating the amount of time, effort that will need to go into this. But I think together with the academia, working group members, and vendors, I think it's certainly doable. So I thought there was another slide over here, but let me go back now that we've spoken about the use cases. We've kind of shared the problem statement. Let's go back to the 2 polling questions before we open it up to Q&A. So if you could take a moment and just respond to the poll. Now, I was told there was a slide in here that reflected the answers. Perhaps not, but I'll just give you a minute to go over the slide and maybe shoot way back and see if use cases are again over here as listed. All right, so while folks are kind of, I think, entering the data for the polling, let's entertain some questions, if there are any. There's.
As you develop this exchange, is part of what you're working on also a framework for maybe like a single orchestrator? Because as you said, if you buy a new company via acquisition, now you've got 4, 5, 6 different orchestrators. The networks can all talk to each other, which is great, right? But now you've got a multitude of orchestrators that you have to manage. Is there any part of this working group focused on that?
No, there isn't actually, but there's been talk amongst the working groups, right? So if you go to the next 2 rooms that are talking about overlay from a standpoint of storage and or a compute containers, we've not had the chance to kind of connect and get together with the other 2 working groups to see how we could kind of formulate the common OSS schema that you're talking to. I guess that would be the next step for us, right? For us, it was moving from where we were at with deployments to, hey, this is the need of the hour. But certainly, I do see that as a mutual progression. Yeah. So, to answer your question, I think we've spoken about it at least at the ONUG board level in terms of how we approach the work activity that each of the working groups are doing. It's not our intent or desire to set standards. So we want to be very clear on that. There are working groups, that kind of define and create standards, and that's great. I think what the consensus that we arrived at least at the board level, was that once we had this buy-in and we had these frameworks, we would then take it to any of the standards bodies to say, hey, here's something that we took from infancy and concept to something that's being worked on. Do you want to now take this under your wings and come up with sets of standards that you think can be applied on a global basis? So that's where it's at the moment, right? I don't. Like I said, I think it's not our desire to kind of start to create standards. We're a representative of large enterprise companies from different verticals, and far be it from moving away from what we have to do on a daily basis as part of our jobs for the companies that we work for, to kind of setting standards. Not that that's not appealing. That's certainly appealing. It has its place, but we didn't want to kind of in any way impede the work activity that we have ongoing, because clearly from what I've seen, at least in the SD-WAN space, we've started a momentum, right? It's a shared momentum, if you will, from both the vendor perspective as well as enterprise companies that we're with that apply these technologies to create solutions to move the business. So yeah, anything you want to add, Zakir or Snail?
No, I just wanted to add that there is no standard. Like IETF doesn't have any standard for SD-WAN, right? Everything is proprietary. So in future, it is possible that once we have some framework, someone like ONU can take it to IETF or any other standards bodies and then have a standard for this open SD-WAN exchange point.
And I'm not necessarily saying that you guys got to create the standards. It's a lot of work. It's a thankless job, and the world will be annoyed with you. You see, if some of the other bodies, like NAC, like WiMAX, like LCE, can actually start looking at the fact that people are employing these types of solutions, and the solution needs to be deployed in a very easy to deploy way, and start coming out with standards that would make it possible. Because one of the bigger challenges that often gets overlooked in deploying some of these solutions, and so has the best specific vendors, is how do you come up with a solution that is deployed over Ethernet, LTE, satellite, WiMAX, and there would be a common framework that would make it easy to deploy this.
Want to take that? Or? So I don't disagree at all with what you're saying, right? But I think it's a journey, right? And I think that with the workshops that we're going to engage in with academia, in tandem working with enterprises, it's a stronger case to take to any of the standards bodies, right? Because you at least have a case. And so we'll be in a better position for any of the bodies to accept this as work activity that could be furthered by virtue of a global standard. I'll just leave it at that.
So maybe I can add one more point to that. It's so even though we don't specify standards, or we don't come up with standards, what we do is from our collective experience, we define requirements of what the standard should be, or what the solution should be. So from there, the collective experience that we have from between the enterprises and the service providers, it kind of comes together as a set of requirements which can then drive the standards towards it. So thereafter it can be taken up, like Conrad and Snehal had pointed out, it can be taken up by any other standard body.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you prescribe these requirements, right? So is it also possible to sort of take into account what the expertise level of
your existing operation teams or engineering teams first, right? So for example, let's say some teams are very familiar with stuff like BGP. This seems to be almost tailor-made for something like BGP. I mean, it's a solved problem, right? So why would we not take the next step and say, why don't you try to do this with BGP? I mean, as opposed to the vendors sort of rediscovering another protocol, and then all of us having to learn that protocol.
So the question was, why don't we adopt the underlay protocol BGP, right? Well, some vendors use BGP as well as within the overlay, so not necessarily true that it's abstracted. But that happens today, right? So what would we be changing? You have from your head-end unit, you're reliant. You're still so even though you're running SD-WAN, you're still reliant on the underlay. You're still reliant on the underlay protocols. One of which, depending upon what protocol you have in production, could conceivably be BGP. So you're already doing it today. In the context of SD-WAN, it's all about prefix and prefix-based routing tied to service points sitting in your data center or at some other forms of compute connect. So when you talk about mergers and acquisitions, when you talk about connecting to ISPs or cloud service providers, then doing it via BGP is the traditional way. SD-WAN is supposed to simplify things. And so if you've simplified it in the context of your own network for the prefixes that you manage, control, trust, and secure, then you're going back to the traditional way of utilizing BGP to make that connect happen, which is really legacy, right? So it's how B2B connects get done via BGP, at DMZs, et cetera. SD-WAN is supposed to simplify these things. And so
Specifically referring to the exchange, I forget what exactly you call it, but
yeah, so we don't want to be prescriptive about, like, I think we said this before, right? I think folks gravitate. Sorry, I'm losing. So folks gravitate towards the existing set of protocols and/or infrastructures, right? I think one of the questions that we got back to from one of the vendors was, "Hey, I'm not going to be sharing policies," and this vendor really had policies that were very application-centric, right? So we weren't necessarily asking them to share the policies. We were asking them to think more about how does trust get established that forms the basis for the SD-WAN exchange point, right? I think we've got to start there. I think the discussion that I had just yesterday with another vendor, I think they were in agreement because unknowns to me, they were already talking amongst the different vendors to say, hey, how do we think about making this happen? And I think they also came to the consensus that, hey, we need to start with where does security where does it get placed and how is that trust established, right? So they're already thinking in terms of let's start there, and then we get to what we expect of the control plane, protocol, format, structure, and the same for any controls around the forwarding plane.
Gartner really divides the vendor space into three major categories. First category is sort of the traditional networking companies that are starting to embark into the SD-WAN space. Second category are essentially packet switching type technologies, vendors that have been playing in the space for about 7 years before the buzzword SD-WAN really existed. And the third category are sort of the pure play startup SD-WAN companies that that built this product, that built their product from the ground up. And especially if you look at the packet switching category, a lot of these vendors don't even support or have to rely on open networking protocols or BGP or OSPF integrations to make their product function. So there's some commonalities between the vendors within each one of these categories, but as a whole, if you look at from category to category, the architectures and foundation and interpretations of what an SD-WAN really is and what it really means are fundamentally different. So how do you cross that bridge, and how do you come to the commonality when there's no commonality
I mean, it's just, I think, how networks have evolved, right? I mean, so the three different groups that you're referring to is the traditional legacy vendors that went about doing switching and routing, and then at some point in time, applications needed to be optimized from a wide area perspective because they were traversing different transport links. Communications was very intensive, and so they came up with, so you had a whole slew of what I would call as wide area acceleration or wide area optimization devices that were purpose-built to do local caching, send less bits and bytes on the WAN, and work in a symmetric manner between a remote site and a data center. And then you had SD-WAN infancy, or rather the startup companies that said, hey, I can do what both the traditional vendors are doing, couple that with what the wide area acceleration companies are doing, and I can do something better, something that's more real time and dynamic, something that's the need of the hour, because most enterprises had transitioned from private point-to-point circuits to frame relay to MPLS networks, right? Thinking that they will get a lot more mileage from MPLS networks. Well, that never really happened because much of the control with MPLS networks lies with the carrier. And at the same time, there was this operational issue of delayed cycles to provision circuits, whether they were copper circuits or fiber-based circuits of higher speeds. So you've got anywhere from 30, 60, 90, in some cases 6 months of wait times. Internet at the same time was approaching with higher bandwidth speeds at price points that were very, I want to say, enterprise customers were very receptive to the price points because they knew the deltas were huge and there's savings to be had over there. So it was kind of like a perfect storm for startup companies to enter that space and say, hey, I can do the best of both. And at the same time, you can start to bring in broadband internet connects at varying capacities while the carriers get their act together and in terms of provisioning the traditional MPLS circuits that you might have had, right? So I think it was a catalyst, if you will. Certainly, it was a journey, and the SD-WAN startups truly, I think, capitalized on that need. And so, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, we can look back, and certainly the SD-WAN companies too. If you look at most of the folks that work at the startups have actually had parts of the career in either the acceleration companies from a wide area perspective or in traditional networking companies, right? But I think fact is, if you fast forward to today, together with the startups, the traditional companies too have come along for the ride, as well as the wide area acceleration companies, or at least the companies that started as wide area acceleration companies are now also playing in the SD-WAN space, right? So I think there's a consensus there that all brought them to the SD-WAN solution, and so now it's a matter of saying, hey, I think from what I've seen, all of them are in agreement that this is the next step forward. So each of them have taken different paths to get to where we are, but I think that's just a fact of life. So.
And to add to what Conrad said, in my opinion, and many of you might not agree with it, but one of the important feature of SD-WAN is to separate control plane and data plane. And once the control plane and data plane is separated, then I want to build the overlays, the tunnels on using any type of transport circuits. The SD-WAN solution is supposed to be transport agnostic. So that's where we are looking at the most benefit from the open SD-WAN exchange point, which would be category 3 and probably category 2 from what you mentioned. Category 1, which is the traditional routing and all that, I don't think you would get true benefits, and we already have standards in that category where all the vendors interoperate with each other.
So just to add to that, it's even though we don't really go into the specifying which protocols or what they should be using and what not, there is an implicit requirement that at the boundary, the SD-WAN has to interoperate with the legacy networks and legacy protocols. So it is like we don't want it to kind of define the like pick the winners and losers or whatever. Like rather we wanted to just kind of leave it at the requirement level and let this vendors solve with their creativity as to however they wanted to solve that issue, solve the problem. So that way we have a range of solutions and we have choice in picking up the solutions.
Hey, thank you, Zakir, thank you, Snehal. I know I'm over time over here, so I've just got 1 minute to summarize. I think so. SD-WAN 2.0 is here to stay. Glad to say that there's consensus amongst both working group members from enterprise companies from different verticals, not just the financials. It's pharma, there's retail, and a whole other academia as well, right? So I think that's a good start, and I think you folks in this room have actually underlined the fact that if there was a way of securely exchanging information between different vendor SD-WAN controllers, would that increase your appetite to deployment? And as I'm speaking, I see that so it's a 3/4 ratio. 75% of you say yes, and about 25% of you say no. So, but hey, it's here to stay, and stay plugged in. We'll certainly be available for any questions that you might have of us, either individually or collectively after this. But thank you for your time, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.